Whispers followed Eleanor, wherever she walked through Millbrook's muddy streets. Behind shuttered windows, voices spoke in hushed tones about the strange woman who lived alone at the forest's edge, gathering herbs when others slept, and speaking to plants as if they could answer back. Her fingers were always stained green from her work, her hair hung loose instead of pinned proper, and worst of all, she had no husband to keep her in line. Unnatural, the women muttered as they kneaded bread and scrubbed floors. No decent woman lives alone like that. But what truly frightened them was how the sick animals brought to her door always seemed to recover, how her garden flourished when others withered, and how she could deliver babies that other midwives had given up for lost. Eleanor had arrived in Millbrook 3 winters past, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel filled with dried roots and bottled tinctures. She spoke little of her origins, only saying she had learned her craft from her grandmother in the old country. Within weeks, she had built herself a small cabin where the forest met the fields, far enough from town to avoid daily scrutiny, but close enough for desperate souls to find her when they needed healing. At first, people came reluctantly. A farmer whose prize cow had fallen ill, a merchant's wife struggling with a difficult pregnancy, a child burning with fever, while the town doctor shook his head helplessly. Each time, Eleanor would listen carefully, her grey eyes studying the patient with an intensity that made some uncomfortable. She would disappear into her garden or the woods beyond, returning with combinations of plants that somehow always seemed to work. Success bred suspicion. When Eleanor saved a baby who had stopped breathing during birth, the townspeople didn't celebrate a miracle. They whispered about dark bargains and supernatural intervention. When she helped a barren woman finally conceive after years of trying, they wondered what price had been paid. Her healing touch became something sinister in their minds. Her knowledge transformed into evidence of wickedness. Reverend Morrison led the growing chorus of condemnation from his pulpit each Sunday. "Beware the woman who works in darkness," he thundered, his voice echoing off the wooden rafters. "God's healing comes through prayer and righteous living, not through potions brewed in shadowy corners." His congregation nodded solemnly, their fear finding validation in his words. Sheriff James Hawthorne listened to these sermons with growing unease, but for different reasons than his neighbors. A practical man who dealt in facts rather than fears, he had watched Eleanor's work with grudging respect. She asked for little payment, never turned away the truly desperate, and seemed to genuinely care about easing suffering. Yet he also understood the dangerous mood settling over his town like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Eleanor felt the shift in how people looked at her. Where once they had met her eyes with gratitude, now they glanced away quickly, crossing themselves or clutching protective charms. Children who had once waved from doorways now hid behind their mother's skirts when she passed. The few coins she earned from her healing work dwindled as people chose to let their animals die rather than risk being seen seeking her help. One particularly cold evening, as Eleanor tended her winter garden by lantern light, she heard the sound of approaching horses. 6 men rode toward her cabin, their faces grim beneath their hats. At their head rode Reverend Morrison, his black coat billowing behind him like dark wings. Beside him, Sheriff Hawthorne sat rigid in his saddle, his hand resting uneasily on his pistol. "Eleanor Blackwood," Morrison's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "You stand accused of practicing witchcraft and consorting with dark forces." His eyes gleamed with righteous fury in the flickering light. "These good men have come to escort you to face judgment for your crimes against God and nature." Eleanor straightened slowly, dirt falling from her hands as she faced the mounted men. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "What crimes, Reverend? Healing the sick, delivering healthy babies, helping crops grow where they had failed? Ungodly works wrought through unholy means." Morrison spat. "No decent woman possesses such knowledge without supernatural aid. You traffic with demons, woman, and this town will no longer tolerate your presence." Sheriff Hawthorne shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The law demanded evidence, and he had seen none of the supernatural activity Morrison claimed. Yet the pressure from the town's leaders had become impossible to ignore. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you need to come with us. There will be a proper hearing where you can defend yourself." She looked at each man in turn, seeing fear and determination in their faces. These were neighbors she had helped, men whose wives had sought her aid in childbirth, fathers whose children she had nursed through fevers. Now they stared at her as if she was something monstrous, something to be destroyed rather than reasoned with. "I'll not resist," Eleanor said finally, removing her dirt-stained apron and hanging it carefully on a fence post. "But I pray you'll remember this moment when you need healing and find none willing to provide it." They bound her hands, not cruelly, for Sheriff Hawthorne insisted on that mercy, and led her into town. Word of her capture spread quickly, and by dawn, a crowd had gathered in the square outside the makeshift courthouse. Angry voices called for immediate justice, for fire to cleanse the evil from their midst. Eleanor sat in the small jail cell, listening to their fury and wondering how healing had become synonymous with horror in their minds. For 3 days, the town prepared for her trial. Witnesses came forward with stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. A cow had sickened after Eleanor looked at it, never mind that she had actually cured the animal. A woman's milk had dried up after arguing with Eleanor, ignoring the fact that Eleanor had provided herbs to restore it. Each act of kindness was twisted into evidence of malevolence, each success reframed as proof of supernatural interference. During those long hours in captivity, Eleanor found herself thinking not of her own fate, but of the people who would suffer when she was gone. Old Margaret, whose arthritis Eleanor had been treating with willow bark tea. Young Sarah, 7 months pregnant with her first child and terrified of the birthing to come. The Morrison boy himself, whose terrible cough Eleanor had noticed during her capture, but whom she would never be allowed to treat now. On the 4th day, everything changed. Sheriff Hawthorne burst into the jail at dawn, his face pale with panic and his hands shaking as he fumbled with the cell keys. "Eleanor," he gasped, "you have to come with me now, please." She stood slowly, studying his face. "What's happened?" "My son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thomas. He's dying, Eleanor. The fever took him in the night, and he can't breathe properly. His mother is beside herself, and the doctor—" He shook his head helplessly. "The doctor says there's nothing more to be done. Says to prepare for the worst." Eleanor felt her heart clench. Thomas Hawthorne was barely 8 years old, a bright boy with his father's serious eyes and his mother's gentle smile. She had watched him play in the streets, had smiled when he tipped his cap politely as she passed. The thought of him struggling for breath while fever consumed his small body made her forget her own peril entirely. "Take me to him," she said without hesitation. Sheriff Hawthorne stared at her. "You understand what this means? If you help him, if you save him, some will say it proves you have supernatural powers. If you can't," he swallowed hard, "if you can't save him, others will say you killed him out of spite. Either way, it could make things worse for you." Eleanor was already moving toward the door. "That child's life matters more than my reputation or my safety. Take me to him now." They rode through the awakening town, Sheriff Hawthorne's urgency overriding any concern for what people might think of his desperate choice. At his house, they found chaos. Thomas lay in his small bed, his breathing rapid and shallow, his face flushed with fever. His mother, Margaret Hawthorne, knelt beside him weeping, while the town doctor packed his instruments with grim finality. "James, what have you done?" Dr. Patterson demanded when he saw Eleanor enter. "Bringing that woman here now, when the boy is clearly beyond hope. You'll only give people more reason to get out," Sheriff Hawthorne said quietly, but with such force that the doctor stepped back. "Get out of my house and let her work." Eleanor approached the bed slowly, her trained eye taking in every detail of the boy's condition. His breathing was labored, his pulse rapid and weak. The fever had taken hold with vicious intensity, and she could see the bluish tinge around his lips that spoke of lungs struggling for air. She had seen this sickness before, pneumonia, often fatal in children so young. "I need hot water," she said calmly, already mentally cataloguing which herbs she would need. "And someone to ride to my cabin for my supplies. The brown leather bag on the shelf above my bed contains what I need." Margaret Hawthorne looked up through her tears. "You can help him, truly." Eleanor knelt beside the bed, gently placing her hand on the boy's forehead. His skin burned beneath her palm, but she had felt worse and seen recovery. "I can try," she said honestly, "but it will take time, and his condition is serious. I need you to trust me completely and do exactly as I say." Oh. For the next 6 hours, Eleanor worked with quiet intensity. She brewed teas from elderflower and willow bark to break the fever. She created steam tents using eucalyptus and thyme to help clear his congested lungs. Most importantly, she prepared a careful mixture of herbs that would help his body fight the infection, knowledge passed down through generations of healing women who had learned to work with nature's pharmacy. Word of her presence in the sheriff's house spread quickly through Millbrook. A crowd gathered outside, some calling for her immediate removal, others arguing that even a witch deserved the chance to prove her innocence through good works. Reverend Morrison arrived in a fury, demanding that Sheriff Hawthorne see reason and remove the corrupting influence from his home. "That woman's presence will damn your son's soul," Morrison declared from the front porch. "Better he die clean in God's grace than live tainted by her dark arts." Sheriff Hawthorne stepped outside to face the Reverend, his face hard with a parent's desperate resolve. "My son is dying," he said slowly. "If you think I care more about your religious opinions than his life, you understand nothing about being a father." Inside, Eleanor continued her work, oblivious to the growing crowd outside. She spoke softly to Thomas as she tended him, telling him stories of brave knights and magical forests, her voice serving as an anchor in his fevered dreams. She monitored his breathing constantly, adjusting her treatments as his condition fluctuated. As evening approached, the crisis came. Thomas's breathing became so labored that Margaret began praying aloud, certain she was watching her son's final moments. Eleanor worked frantically, using every technique she knew to help him breathe, to keep the infection from overwhelming his small body completely. Then, just as the sun set behind the hills, something shifted. Thomas's breathing eased slightly. His fever, which had raged unchecked for hours, began to break. By midnight, he was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, his color returning to normal, his pulse growing stronger. Eleanor finally allowed herself to rest, slumping in the chair beside his bed. Margaret Hawthorne knelt beside her, taking her hands. "How can I ever thank you?" she whispered. "You brought my boy back from death's door." "Thank God, not me," Eleanor replied wearily. "I simply used the knowledge I was given to help nature heal itself." By morning, Thomas was sitting up and asking for food. The crowd outside had grown larger, but their mood had shifted dramatically. Parents who had lost children to similar fevers wept openly at the news of his recovery. Others began questioning whether they had been wrong about Eleanor's true nature. Sheriff Hawthorne stood before the crowd, his son healthy and laughing in his arms. "This woman," he said in a voice that carried across the square, "saved my boy's life using nothing but knowledge, skill, and compassion. If that makes her a witch, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we mean by evil." But Reverend Morrison was not ready to concede defeat. "Do not be deceived by apparent kindness," he warned the crowd. "Satan himself can appear as an angel of light. This woman's success only proves her supernatural connections. No mere mortal could have achieved such results." Eleanor stepped forward then, her voice clear and strong despite her exhaustion. "I used elderflower to reduce fever, willow bark for pain, eucalyptus to clear congestion, and thyme for its healing properties. These are gifts God placed in nature for those wise enough to use them. If you call that witchcraft, then you condemn the very creation your God made for our benefit." An old woman in the crowd spoke up suddenly. "She helped my granddaughter when no one else would. When the baby wouldn't turn for birthing, Eleanor came in the night and saved both mother and child." Others began sharing their stories. Animals healed, fevers broken, difficult births made safe. The tide was turning, but Eleanor knew her position remained precarious. Fear, once planted, was difficult to uproot entirely. She looked at the faces around her, some grateful, some suspicious, all uncertain about what to believe. "I understand your fear," she said to the crowd. "I know my ways seem strange to those who haven't learned them, but I offer you a choice. Judge me not by superstition or rumor, but by my actions. Let me continue to help where I can. And if you find true evil in my work rather than healing, then cast me out with justice." Sheriff Hawthorne nodded slowly. "The woman deserves a fair chance. My son lives because of her skill, and I'll not see her condemned for using that skill to help others." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's position in Millbrook gradually stabilized. Some continued to view her with suspicion, crossing themselves when she passed and avoiding her gaze. But others began seeking her help more openly, speaking of her work as healing rather than witchcraft. She treated each patient with the same careful attention, never turning away those who needed her aid. Reverend Morrison continued his campaign against her from the pulpit, but his words carried less weight now that people had seen the results of her work firsthand. When young Thomas Hawthorne appeared in church the following Sunday, healthy and glowing, even Morrison's most faithful followers began to question whether healing could truly be evil. Eleanor established a small clinic behind her cabin where people could come for treatment without fear of judgment from their neighbors. She began teaching willing students about herbal medicine, passing on knowledge that had been preserved by generations of healing women. Slowly, understanding began to replace fear in the hearts of many townspeople. Years passed, and Eleanor's reputation evolved from that of a dangerous witch to a valued healer. When epidemics threatened the town, she worked tirelessly to contain them. When difficult pregnancies arose, mothers specifically requested her aid. Her garden became a place of learning where apprentices came to study the healing arts. Sheriff Hawthorne remained one of her strongest supporters, never forgetting the night she had risked everything to save his son. Thomas grew into a young man who spoke proudly of the woman who had saved his life, defending her against any who still whispered of witchcraft and dark arts. One autumn day, as Eleanor tended her garden with hands now lined with age, a young woman approached carrying a feverish infant. "Please," the woman begged, "they say you can help when others cannot. My baby is so sick, and I don't know where else to turn." Eleanor looked at the desperate mother and saw herself in those early days, alone, frightened, seeking someone who would care more about healing than about fear. She reached out gently to take the child, her touch still sure despite the years. "Come inside," she said softly. "Let's see what we can do." As she carried the infant toward her cabin, Eleanor reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She had been called a witch, threatened with fire, imprisoned for the crime of healing, yet here she stood, still serving those who needed her, still working to ease suffering wherever she found it. Behind her, the mother followed with desperate hope, while in the distance, other townspeople watched with acceptance rather than fear. The whispers that had once condemned her now spoke of her skill, her compassion, her willingness to help when others turned away. Eleanor smiled as she entered her cabin, the baby already quieting in her arms. Let them call her what they would, witch, healer, wise woman, or heretic. She knew who she was and why she did this work. In a world often cruel and unforgiving, she had chosen to be a force for healing, and no amount of fear or superstition would turn her from that path. Outside, her garden rustled in the autumn breeze, heavy with the herbs that would become tomorrow's medicines. And somewhere in town, a young man named Thomas Hawthorne went about his business, living proof that sometimes those called witches were simply women brave enough to heal when healing was desperately needed. The story of Eleanor Blackwood became legend in Millbrook, passed down through generations as a reminder that wisdom and compassion should never be mistaken for evil, and that sometimes those society fears most are the very ones it needs most desperately. Her legacy lived on in every life she saved, every child she delivered safely, every fever she broke with her gentle hands and ancient knowledge. In the end, she had proven that the most powerful magic was simply the courage to help others, regardless of the cost to oneself. And in a world that often forgot the value of such courage, that lesson remained as vital as any herb in her carefully tended garden. Eleanor lived to see children she had delivered grow into adults who brought their own babies to her door. She watched former enemies become friends as understanding slowly replaced ignorance. When her hair turned silver and her steps grew slower, she trained a new generation of healers who carried forward her methods and her philosophy of compassionate care. Among her most devoted students was Sarah Mitchell, a young woman whose mother had nearly died in childbirth until Eleanor's intervention saved both lives. Sarah possessed natural talent and an insatiable curiosity about the healing arts that reminded Eleanor of herself in younger days. Under Eleanor's guidance, Sarah learned not just which herbs to use, but how to read the subtle signs of illness that others missed, how to comfort frightened patients with gentle words, and most importantly, how to persist in the face of ignorance and opposition. Remember, Eleanor would tell her students as they worked together in the garden, healing is as much about listening as it is about medicine. Every patient has a story. Every illness has a context. Treat the whole person, not just the symptoms, and never let pride or impatience cloud your judgment. Sarah proved an apt pupil, eventually establishing her own practice in a neighboring town where she faced many of the same challenges Eleanor had overcome. When letters arrived telling of Sarah's successes, Eleanor would smile with the satisfaction of knowing her knowledge would survive her passing. There were difficult times even in Eleanor's later years. A particularly harsh winter brought an outbreak of influenza that tested all her skills. Working alongside the town's new doctor, a young man fresh from medical school who had initially been skeptical of her methods, Eleanor helped care for dozens of patients. Dr. William Carter watched in amazement as her herbal treatments complemented his modern medicine, often achieving better results than either approach could manage alone. "How do you know which combination to use?" he asked one evening as they treated a family of 6, all stricken with fever. Eleanor smiled as she prepared another batch of willow bark tea. Experience, observation, and a willingness to admit when something isn't working. Medical knowledge isn't about competition between old and new ways. It's about using whatever helps the patient heal. Their collaboration marked a turning point for Millbrook. The partnership between traditional healing and modern medicine became a model that other towns began to emulate. Eleanor found herself consulted not just by desperate patients, but by physicians seeking to understand the wisdom behind her methods. One particularly memorable case involved a traveling merchant who arrived in town with what appeared to be a hopeless infection in his leg. Dr. Carter had recommended amputation to save the man's life, but Eleanor asked for 3 days to try a different approach. Using a combination of antiseptic herbs, careful wound cleaning, and a treatment protocol she had learned from her grandmother, she gradually fought back the infection. The merchant kept his leg and his livelihood, becoming another voice spreading Eleanor's reputation across the region. As word of such successes spread, Eleanor found herself receiving visitors from distant places. A delegation of Cherokee healers came to share knowledge and compare techniques. Their visit lasted a week, during which both sides learned valuable lessons about the universal principles of healing that transcended cultural boundaries. Eleanor was particularly fascinated by their spiritual approach to medicine, incorporating ceremony and prayer into the healing process. "We are all students," she told the Cherokee medicine woman who led their group. "The plants teach us, the patients teach us, and we teach each other. Wisdom grows when it is shared." During those golden years of Eleanor's life, Millbrook transformed from a town divided by fear into a community known for its progressive approach to healthcare. People came from hundreds of miles away seeking treatment that combined the best of traditional and modern methods. Eleanor's clinic expanded into a small hospital where patients could receive comprehensive care. Thomas Hawthorne, the sheriff's son whose life she had saved, became one of her strongest advocates. Now a successful lawyer, he often defended healers in other towns who faced persecution similar to what Eleanor had endured. His passionate speeches about the difference between superstition and science, between fear and reason, helped change laws that had been used to prosecute traditional healers. "I stand before you as living proof," he would tell courtrooms filled with skeptical judges and hostile witnesses, "that what some call witchcraft, others recognize as the highest form of human compassion. This woman saved my life when I was a dying child, and she has saved countless others since. If we condemn healing simply because we don't understand its methods, we condemn ourselves to unnecessary suffering." Eleanor also faced personal challenges during these years. A fire destroyed part of her clinic, along with irreplaceable books and supplies she had collected over decades. The entire community rallied to help rebuild, with former patients donating materials and labor. The new clinic was larger and better equipped than before, a testament to how completely she had won the town's respect and affection. During the reconstruction, Eleanor lived temporarily with the Hawthorne family. Margaret Hawthorne, who had once wept beside her dying son's bed, now treated Eleanor like the sister she had never had. They spent long evenings sharing stories and preparing medications together, Margaret having become skilled in basic healing arts under Eleanor's tutelage. "You gave me back my son," Margaret said one night as they worked by lamplight, grinding herbs for the next day's patients. "But you gave me so much more than that. You showed me that women could be strong and independent, that we didn't have to accept limitations others placed on us." Eleanor's influence extended beyond medicine into the broader question of women's roles in society. Young women throughout the region began pursuing education and careers that had previously been closed to them, inspired by Eleanor's example of refusing to accept society's narrow definitions of what women could accomplish. She became an inadvertent pioneer for women's rights, though she always insisted her primary concern was simply helping people heal. One of her proudest achievements was establishing a formal school for healers that accepted both men and women as students. This revolutionary approach drew criticism from traditional medical institutions, but Eleanor persisted, believing that healing knowledge belonged to anyone willing to dedicate themselves to serving others. The school's graduates went on to practice throughout the country, carrying with them not only medical knowledge, but also Eleanor's philosophy of compassionate, inclusive care. Her daily routine in those later years reflected a life lived with purpose and contentment. Each dawn found her in the garden, speaking softly to her plants as she harvested what was needed for the day's work. She would spend hours with patients, never rushing, always listening carefully to their concerns. Evenings were devoted to teaching, writing detailed notes about her treatments for future reference, and corresponding with healers in distant places who sought her advice. Despite her advancing age, Eleanor continued to take on the most challenging cases. When a mysterious illness struck the children at the local orphanage, she worked tirelessly for weeks to identify the cause and develop an effective treatment. Her investigation revealed contaminated water from a new well, and her intervention saved dozens of young lives while establishing new standards for public health in the community. Eleanor's reputation had grown so significantly that when a delegation from the territorial capital arrived seeking her expertise during a cholera outbreak, The entire town swelled with pride. The governor himself had requested her consultation, recognizing that her methods had prevented similar outbreaks in surrounding areas. She spent 3 months in the capital, working alongside the territory's most prominent physicians to contain the epidemic and establish protocols that would prevent future occurrences. During her time in the capital, Eleanor encountered Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a young woman who had struggled to gain acceptance in the male-dominated medical profession. Elizabeth was the niece of Reverend Morrison, the very man who had once called for Eleanor's execution as a witch. The irony was not lost on either woman when they met in the hospital where both were treating cholera patients. "My uncle spoke of you often," Elizabeth said quietly during a break between patients. "He called you dangerous, evil, a threat to everything decent and godly. Yet here you are, saving lives while I struggle to convince colleagues that a woman can be trusted with a scalpel." Eleanor studied the young doctor with keen interest. Elizabeth possessed both the formal training Eleanor had never received and the natural compassion that could not be taught in any school. "Your uncle feared what he didn't understand," Eleanor replied gently. "But fear often masks a deeper truth. Perhaps he sensed that women like us represent change, and change frightens those who benefit from the current order." Their collaboration during the cholera crisis forged a deep friendship that would last the rest of Eleanor's life. Elizabeth learned Eleanor's herbal techniques while teaching her about surgical procedures and anatomical knowledge. Together, they developed treatment protocols that combined traditional healing with modern medical science, achieving remarkable success rates that drew attention from physicians across the country. When Eleanor finally returned to Millbrook, she brought with her not only Elizabeth's friendship, but also official recognition from the territorial government. The governor had appointed her as the region's first director of public health, a position that gave her authority to investigate disease outbreaks, establish health standards, and coordinate medical responses across multiple communities. This appointment created both opportunities and challenges. While many celebrated Eleanor's official recognition, others resented a woman holding such authority, particularly one with her controversial background. Political opponents tried to use her past accusations of witchcraft against her, but the overwhelming evidence of her competence and the testimonials of hundreds of grateful patients rendered such attacks ineffective. Eleanor used her new position to establish a network of trained healers throughout the territory. She traveled extensively, visiting remote settlements where medical care was virtually non-existent. In each community, she identified promising individuals who could be trained in basic medical skills, creating a system of care that reached far beyond what any single healer could accomplish alone. One of her most significant challenges came when she encountered a community that had been devastated by smallpox. The disease had killed nearly half the population, and survivors lived in terror of its return. Eleanor had learned about inoculation techniques during her time in the capital, but implementing them required overcoming deep-seated fears and superstitions that rivaled the worst persecution she had faced in her early days. The community's leaders initially refused to allow inoculation, declaring it an abomination against divine will. Eleanor spent weeks living among them, treating other ailments and gradually building trust. She shared meals with families, played with children, and listened to the stories of those who had lost loved ones to the disease. Slowly, she began to change minds through patient education and personal example. "I understand your fear," she told a gathering of community leaders one evening. "You've seen death take your loved ones, and now someone comes offering to deliberately expose your healthy children to the very disease that killed their siblings. It seems like madness. But I've seen communities where inoculation prevented outbreaks that would have killed hundreds. The choice is between a small, controlled risk now and a devastating epidemic later." Her persistence eventually paid off when several families agreed to have their children inoculated. When those children remained healthy, while an outbreak struck a neighboring settlement, the entire community embraced the practice. Eleanor's careful documentation of the results provided valuable data that supported wider adoption of inoculation throughout the territory. During this period, Eleanor also faced personal losses that tested her emotional resilience. Margaret Hawthorne, who had become like a sister to her, died suddenly of a heart condition that even Eleanor's skills could not treat. The loss devastated Eleanor, who had grown to depend on Margaret's friendship and support during difficult times. Sheriff Hawthorne, now an older man himself, found Eleanor weeping in Margaret's garden the day after the funeral. "She believed in you when no one else would," he said quietly, sitting beside her on the bench where the two women had spent countless evenings talking and working together. "She saved me as much as I saved Thomas," Eleanor replied through her tears. "When this whole town wanted to burn me alive, she opened her home and her heart. I don't know how to continue without her wisdom and kindness." "You continue by being the woman she believed you were," Thomas said, joining them in the garden. Now a father himself, he carried his infant daughter who had been born just weeks before Margaret's death. "You continue by teaching others to show the same courage and compassion she showed you." Eleanor found solace in her work and in training the next generation of healers. Her school had grown into a respected institution that attracted students from across the country. The curriculum she developed balanced theoretical knowledge with practical experience, emphasizing the importance of treating patients with dignity and respect, regardless of their social status or background. Among her students was a young man named David Running Bear, whose Cherokee heritage initially made him unwelcome in many medical circles. Eleanor not only accepted him into her program, but highlighted the valuable contributions his traditional knowledge could make to modern healing practices. David's thesis on the medicinal properties of native plants became one of the most referenced works in the field and helped establish respect for indigenous medical knowledge. Eleanor's influence reached its peak when she was invited to address the newly formed American Medical Association. Standing before an audience of the country's most prominent physicians, she delivered a speech that challenged the medical establishment to embrace both scientific rigor and compassionate care. "Medicine," she told the assembly, "is not merely the application of scientific knowledge to biological problems. It is the art of healing human beings who are more than the sum of their symptoms. Every patient carries within them a story of suffering, hope, fear, and resilience. Our duty as healers is to see that whole person, not just the disease that brings them to us." Her speech was met with standing ovation from some and stony silence from others. The medical establishment was beginning to change, but slowly and often reluctantly. Eleanor understood that real progress would take generations, but she was content knowing that she had planted seeds that would eventually grow into a more inclusive and compassionate approach to healing. As Eleanor entered her 70s, she began to slow down physically, but remained mentally sharp and deeply engaged with her work. She spent more time writing, documenting not only her medical knowledge, but also her observations about human nature, social change, and the complex relationships between healer and patient. Her journals would later be published as foundational texts in the fields of medical ethics and public health. One particularly poignant entry from this period read, "Today, a young woman brought her daughter to me, the same daughter I delivered during a difficult birth 15 years ago. The girl had broken her arm falling from a tree, but more importantly, she looked at me without fear, without suspicion, with simple trust that I would help her heal. In her eyes, I saw the future I had dreamed of but never dared believe possible, a world where healing is received as a gift rather than viewed with suspicion, where knowledge is valued over superstition, where compassion triumphs over fear." Eleanor's final years were marked by a series of honors that recognized her contributions to medicine and public health. Universities offered her honorary degrees, medical societies inducted her as a distinguished member, and government officials sought her counsel on health policy. Yet she remained most proud of the simple moments: a successful birth, a fever broken, a child's grateful smile. Her last major case involved treating an epidemic of diphtheria that threatened to devastate Millbrook's school children. Though now in her late 70s and walking with a cane, Eleanor worked around the clock for weeks, coordinating treatment efforts and training others in the techniques needed to combat the disease. Her intervention saved numerous young lives and demonstrated that her skills remained as sharp as ever, despite her advancing age. On quiet evenings, she would sit on her porch overlooking the garden she had nurtured for decades, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Sometimes, Thomas Hawthorne, now a successful merchant with children of his own, would visit to thank her once again for the gift of his life. Sometimes, former patients would stop by simply to share their gratitude and speak of how her healing had changed their families forever. When winter finally came for Eleanor Blackwood, she faced it with the same quiet courage she had shown throughout her life. Her funeral drew mourners from 3 counties, farmers and merchants, mothers and children, even some clergy who had come to understand that healing was indeed a sacred calling. They buried her in the cemetery she had been denied in life, her grave marked with a simple stone that read, "She healed with wisdom, loved with courage, and proved that kindness was the truest magic of all." Her cabin became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to learn the healing arts. The garden continued to flourish under the care of her students, its herbs still providing medicine for generations to come. And whenever fear threatened to overcome reason in Millbrook, people would remember Eleanor's story and choose understanding over ignorance, healing over hatred. Her legacy became a lighthouse for all who faced persecution for daring to be different, for choosing compassion over conformity, for believing that helping others was worth any personal cost.